One of my favorite things in the miniature hobby is basing my minis, which is lucky because it's something that you have to do, but I find it is the easiest way to make your minis a cut above. In Warhammer, every unit is a badass, and so I like to represent that by big old bases. I take the tactical rock and I make it a tactical mountain. I love a big base. It is the best way I have found to give my minis a leg up. I've had basing on the brain because in theory, I'm putting together a Tau Kroot army alongside Sean and his brand new Emperor's Children, but I have not been working on my Kroot very much, and Sean has been doing a pretty good job cranking out some units for his Emperor's Children, so I think it's high time I got a little something done for the Tau, and I've got a whole lot of bases to build. I've got this crisis suit team. I found these at my friendly local game store's used shelf. One man's Tau trash is another man's Tau treasure. These guys are pretty well put together, and I outfitted them with the Sunforge weapons, the Melt-A-Guns. Hopefully I can melt some of Sean's tanks with these suckers. And they stand on the big ol' 50mm bases. And I always find the bigger the base, the trickier it is to come up with a good basing scheme, because if it's all just completely flat, it starts to bore me. It's like my guys are walking through a skating rink. And speaking of big old bases, I've got this Tau broadside battlesuit on a monstrous 60mm base. This actually isn't that big in modern Warhammer 40,000. The 60mm base used to be reserved for absolute monstrosities like dreadnoughts, but nowadays, 60 is not all that big. It's one of my favorite basing sizes. I find it really easy to scoot models around the battlefield on these, and it gives some really nice opportunities for doing some fun basing. I like big bases, but sometimes the trickier bases can be the little ones. I've got a bunch of good old Tau stealth suits on some 32mm bases, and since Tau stealth suits are a little bit of like a special unit, their job is to infiltrate, to sneak around, to hide in buildings, and spot things for my Tau army, and so I think for the bases, I want to give them bases that reflect their special operations style. First things first, I'm going to start out with the Crisis Suit team, and to make my bases, I need to get rid of the original bases. I buy a lot of secondhand minis, and I would love to know how they glue them down to the bases, because it's always a huge struggle to get them back up. I chiseled away the old bases, and on the flying guy, I snapped off the flying stand peg and shaved it flat. Some of these guys had some of the base come with their feet, so I dremeled off the remains of the old base and then prepared some of my own. I grabbed some Cobalt Keep 50mm bases and sunk in my magnets. I always put the magnet in first because it takes a little bit of pressure and I want to apply that pressure before I've glued my mini and basing materials. I picked a suit and held it up to the base to start to get some ideas of what I need. To get this fella's gun pointed forward, I need him up and leaning back a little bit. And speaking of that leaning back, his gun sticks out far, so I want him far back on the base so that as much as possible, he fits inside the parameter of the base. To start, I took some thick 1/2 inch cork, which we have on EonsOfBattle.com, and tore off a slice big enough to cover about 3/4 of the base. And I used plenty of ultra thin super glue to stick it down. The cork is porous and the glue is thin, so it soaks in and dries almost instantly. Once I applied some pressure, then I can start editing, using my fingers to pinch and tear off the cork to shape it. Lining up my guy again, I need some more height, so I made another smaller tier using lots of super glue to stick them together. I also poured a little extra glue along the outside seams so that it's really well bonded. Now to carve the cork. I really like this small saw I found at the hardware store for a couple of bucks. This cork is so soft I can easily slice right through it. I went in at an angle, and once I was through, I rechecked with my fella. And now that I know where his feet are gonna go, I can do some more work, carving in another angle and adding in a little more cork. Now I need to rip it up. I tore off a lot of cork, especially around the lip of the base. I don't want any flat cork overhanging. I want it to look like a hole punched out of a mountain. Then I added in some steps to my cliff. I took my knife and sliced horizontally into the cork, and then tore off the top of where my slice is. This leaves me with a nice flat shelf, and I used up some of the cork I've torn off and sliced off, reattaching it upside down to the top surface of my cork construct, taking advantage of the natural irregular shape. Now I have my pile of wood. If I painted it like this, it would look very jagged and porous, like volcanic rock. That would look great if this was a lava base, but I want a windswept desert sandstone, so I want to smooth it out. I took a paper towel in preparation and soaked it with a few mists of water from a squirt bottle, and then broke out my wood filler putty. I took a popsicle stick and smeared this all over every bit of the cork. I pressed it into the cork everywhere, really forcing it into all the cracks. Then once I had one all over coat, I scraped away as much as I could with the popsicle stick, and then used my finger to wipe even more away. The cork is so soft so it bends and flexes under my fingers so I can really get into the cracks and crevices, and once I had removed all that I could, I switched to the wet paper towel and did another round of wiping, and that got off a lot of putty, letting it fill in every crack and crevice so it's smooth and bumpy. I'll let it dry for a little bit, and then while I was waiting, I moved on to the next guy. This suit has both feet firmly planted on the ground, so I want to make him a little shorter and flatter for his base. For this, I reached for my 1/4 inch cork. I tore off a couple of pieces that I glued down, and I made a second tier on each of these little chunks. Once the glue was set, I began tearing up these and making sure that they only overhang the edge of the base by a little bit, as much as I want them to. I used some of the torn off chunks to decorate the empty parts of the base, and once I was happy with my cork, I lathered this one up with the putty as well. I really like the wood filler putty because it's soft like frosting and easily gets all over the base. It dries pretty quick, dry to the touch after about 10 minutes, and once it's fully dry after a few hours, it's incredibly light. This plus the cork lets me really build some big bases that doesn't add too much weight to my minis. I double checked that my fella has plenty of room to maneuver, and then moved on to the suit number 3, the flying dude. For this base, since he's rocketing over top of it, I have a lot of freedom to make a shape that he couldn't stand on. I want to make a peak, and to do this, I tore off chunks of thick cork all around the edges of my tile to get the flat side. And I stacked these together with ultra thin super glue so that all the rough torn edges were on one side and the other side was flat. It took about 5 layers to get a chunk that would fit on top of the 50mm base, and then I took my hobby nippers, but I didn't clip. I just grabbed and twisted to tear off big chunks at a time, sharpening this lump into a point. I hit the bottom on some 60 grit sandpaper to make sure it was completely flat. And then I stuck it down to the base with a lot of super glue. Then I frosted it like a cake, just like the rest of the squad, removing most but not all of the putty, so I'm left with smooth, irregular shapes. Now all 3 of my bases are dry enough to move on to some detail. I want to add some sand to the low and flat spots, so I took some texture paste and globbed this on, taking blobs and spreading them out over the ground, then coming back in with a clean wet brush and pressing this brush into the putty to press down the texture and remove any brush strokes. Now I can attach my minis, and these tower up on their tiptoes, so I'll need to pin them to be sure they'll be stuck down to the bases. I drilled into each foot, inserting some of my sewing straight pins into their toes. I didn't get the angle perfect, but I can use some needle nose pliers to bend them straight, then I stabbed these into the cork. The thin sharp pins stab right through, and in a few spots I can feel I was hitting the plastic base, so I removed my guy and then drilled out these spots. Into the cork and superglue will be strong, but if I can anchor all the way into the plastic, that'll be even stronger. I flipped the base upside down with my guy on there, and then dripped some superglue over the exposed pin. I dripped on some baking soda, which absorbs the glue and makes it dry instantly as a hard resin-like material, and I used some wire cutters to nip off the ends that were sticking out too far. On the flying guy, I drilled up into his toes on an angle to give the impression that he's flying with just his toes dragging on the surface of the rock. I think they're looking stellar, and now to help further sell the desert cliff look, I grabbed my collection of epic basing cactuses. I found some shapes and sizes that would fit on the flat parts of my cork tower bases, and I used some more super glue to stick these down. These bigger bases are really good for giving me more opportunities to use these bits. I can't always make them fit on most of my army, which is 80 crew carnivores on the little 28.5mm bases, so it's fun to really get to splash out on these big fellas. And just like that, my trio of big boys are on their big bases. It's taken me a while to figure out how I like to make cork bases and to find the cork and texture paste I like. Luckily now I know, and it's available to purchase at EonsOfBattle.com. Over at EonsOfBattle.com, we have Army Painter paints, we got the Speed Paint, Fanatics, bundles, and we also have my favorite Vallejo texture pastes. If you're looking for paint, we got it, along with all sorts of other hobby goodies, and we have terrain. It's the best way to support us doing what we do by getting a membership. Each month, members get a credit good for any one terrain pack we've ever made or the brand new one. Our new terrain for November, the Crashed Landers. These spaceships have all the trappings of grimdark futuristic flyers who have met their untimely end, dropping out of the sky to live out their days as dramatic terrain. With weapons, engines, armor, and rivets, these corpses were carrying some precious cargo that never made it to its destination. These ill-fated vehicles were designed by us and are available at EonsOfBattle.com. On a few of these bases, I let the cork overhang the edge of the base dramatically. I feel like this helps make them look more natural. They don't perfectly conform to the 50mm base. And this extra base also helps give a little bumper around the mini so the base hits the ground or table before the mini does. I like to do this especially on small fragile minis like this Moonstone Mini the Fencer. She is the tiniest, most delicate piece of resin with a little resin toothpick sword. So I made the base stick out really far so it helps protect her from colliding with enemy models or terrain while I'm playing. A team of 3 Crisis battle suits ready to rock and roll, and they are now ready to rock and roll because I could play them now that they're on the bases. I would be playing them gray, but sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do to get in games of Warhammer. I really like to give my models, especially my big models, big honkin' bases. It reminds me a lot of the Warhammer artwork, because usually in the big battle scenes, you see the models standing on like nebulous rocky outcroppings or a perfectly placed ledge amidst a sea of debris, and it just makes the models feel bigger and more epic and more heroic. I've got these three guys scooting through a rocky desert environment, but even amongst this one little squad, I've got a couple of different environments going on. I've got one guy on a big, harsh angle. I've got one guy who's pretty much flat with just a couple little pieces of rock. And then I got one guy scooting over a pyramid. And I find that making some different shapes does a really good job of making it look like an actual diorama instead of just 3 models on 3 fairly identical bases. And because these guys are so big and gangly and they kind of break the boundaries of the base in every direction, I feel like they look really good on similarly big, gangly bases that are kind of breaking the rules in every direction as well. Although the stick out on these guys is not too bad. I can get there pretty much in base-to-base contact without them rubbing together. One model I can't do that with is the broadside and this ridiculous railgun sticking out here. This is almost as bad as the Arulian Wardens from Age of Sigmar, the little elves on 32mm bases, who then have like 4 inches of spears sticking out. I don't know if I've ever seen those models in person. Not broken. There's no real way to fix that on the broadside, but there are some tricks I can do with the basing to make it not impact the game so much. The railgun sticks out, which isn't a big problem, but it happens to stick out at exactly the head height for miniatures, which will get annoying when my opponent makes it into base contact, and I have to extract this mini from combat, so I want to just make this problem go away. I started out getting this mini off its original base. Once again, I had to really dig it out, and once I had his feet all cleaned up, I moved on to building him a massive cork tower. I covered the base about 80% in thick 1/2 inch cork, and then I did another layer covering about 60%. Holding my model up to this tower, he needs to lean forward a little so his giant railgun is pointing forwards. I cut down the base and now he's got the right lean. There's still plenty of room, so I started stacking up some more cork in the corner, making a big old tower for him to stand next to. I double checked so I know exactly where his feet will live, and then started tearing up the cork, making a few slices up into the cork to make some new steps, and I tore off a lot of material to reveal the random natural shapes in the cork. Then I lathered it up, smearing the wood paste all over and then wiping it away. Smearing a bunch into my finger and then depositing it back into the dish. After a good wiping with a damp paper towel, I left the base alone for about 5 minutes to let the putty start to firm up. Then I came back in with a toothbrush and started scrubbing. This chisels off even more putty, revealing the points and shapes of the cork even stronger. Then I switched back to the texture paste and lathered up all the flat sections. This guy is huge, so I don't want to use the little sewing pins. Instead, I stuck him down with some 1mm brass rod, and there is plenty of cork for that rod to stick into. Having him really leaning back keeps more of that cannon over the base, and now it's so much taller I don't have to worry about it clinking off my minis' heads. I filled up the surrounding flat spots with some more cactuses, and now my guy is ready for war. My broadside battlesuit is tucked in a nice little valley in the rocks, and it just feels right. He is a big, heavy guy, and he is on a big, heavy base. I feel like if the miniature was made out of clay and the base was made out of clay, and I rolled them up into 2 balls, they would be about the same size. Like the mass of the model equals the mass of the base, and that's what looks best to me. He looks big and chonky, and he feels big and chonky standing on some big old rocks, as opposed to standing on a perfectly flat golf course. Now this does add a fair bit of height. I've got this guy about a little less than an inch bigger than I guess he's supposed to be. And could this be considered modeling for advantage or disadvantage? It's kind of hard to say. He might be able to peek his head over a little bit more terrain than he is, I guess, supposed to be allowed to, but I don't really care. Rules as written in Warhammer 40,000, if 1 pixel of a model can see 1 pixel of another model, you're allowed to shoot. But really, in almost every single game of 40k I've ever played with anyone, unless it's against Sean, there's a gentleman's agreement of, just think about it. You know, 1 little antenna seeing a squad is not him being able to see the other squad, and vice versa. It usually doesn't get that precise. I mean, just in the game, in moving in Warhammer 40,000, there's a lot of wiggle room. You measure like 1 or 2 guys, and then you just scooch everybody else in place. And if you're off by like 1/4 of an inch, that's completely fine. Usually that's how I play a game of 40k, and so unless I do something really egregious with the basing, like put him 3 inches extra tall, it never really matters. Now I have just completed a big honkin' base for a big honkin' model, but now it is time to work on some little dudes. For little guys, I don't really build each base with the actual model in mind. I just start cranking them out and then making them fit later on. I broke these secondhand minis off their original bases and then started working. I want these in the same rocky environment, but they're not clambering over mountains, just stepping through little valleys, so I want them much shorter. To get some variety, on 2 bases, I glued down some 1/2-inch cork, then 2 bases with 1/4-inch cork, and the last 2 bases, no cork, just a little bit of scrap. Then I started carving, giving a couple of bases a nice little angle and slicing into them to get some small steps. I reused some of the chunks I tore off to add in some more texture, and then I lathered them up, just giving them the same smear of filler I did on the other bases. And I used a toothbrush method to remove even more putty. After that, I spread on some texture paste all over the flat sections, giving them some time to dry. I started drilling into my minis' legs, inserting some more brass rod. I dry fit my minis to the bases to see which poses worked best on which base, and then I started attaching my guys. On the foot without the pin, I globbed on a healthy amount of thick superglue and then squished it down, and in no time I had the whole squad standing, and I just filled in the empty space with some more cactuses. Now I'm done basing, and I like to give my wood filler a few squirts of water and a stir to rehydrate the putty, making sure it'll be rich and creamy for next time. Boom! The Tau wing of my Kroot army is finally ready for some paint. It's been sitting in a box for quite a while now, but now all of the bases are done and frankly voluptuous. These are some big old bases, and that's how I like it. To me, a good base is the thing that takes a miniature from a little toy to an accurate representation of the real thing. Warhammer 40,000 is a tabletop wargame. That doesn't mean that you are recreating a battle that took place in the world of Warhammer. It means you are actively participating in it. These windswept desert rocks are the actual desert rocks that me and my Tau are trekking through on our way to shoot Sean in the face with some railguns. With these guys all done, well, they're not painted, but they're built, my Tau army is actually getting kinda close. Other than these guys, the only other big things are 60 more Kroot carnivores, and then 15 Kroot hounds, 5 Vespid stingwings, a couple more Krootox riders, another broadside, another Cold Star commander. There might be a lot of models left, but made some pretty good progress today, and maybe I'll even get some paint on them. We'll see. Thanks for watching.